It was on a sodden October evening that the knock came, a curiously irregular tapping that startled me from the half-doze into which I had fallen by the fire. Outside our Baker Street windows the fog was thick as clotted cream, yellowed by the gas lamps that lined the thoroughfare like watchful sentries. Holmes was pacing, of course, in that relentless style of his which betrayed his disdain for inactivity. His violin lay untouched, and the Times crossword remained half-completed, an affront to his intellect that he had abandoned after declaring it woefully constructed. The knock came again, 3 short taps, then silence. "Not the post," Holmes murmured, pausing, "nor Lestrade. Too uncertain. Someone in distress, perhaps." He turned to me with that electric flicker in his eyes that only appeared when he sensed a problem worthy of his faculties. "Would you be so good, Watson?" I rose, crossing to the door, and opened it upon one of the most curious visitors I had yet encountered in our lodgings. It was a child, no older than 10, dressed in a wool coat several sizes too large, the sleeves turned back and pinned crudely at the wrists. His boots were scuffed, his cap soaked through, and in his gloved hand he held a small, paper-wrapped parcel. But what held my attention most was not his attire, it was his eyes. Wide, dark, and oddly serene, they held the gaze of someone far older than his years. The boy said nothing at first, simply raising the parcel toward me as if it were a gift. "Come in, child," I said gently, stepping aside. Holmes did not wait for introductions. "Close the door, Watson. The fog seeks company." The boy stepped over the threshold with solemn precision and stood in the center of the room like a statue awaiting placement. "You are expected, I presume?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively casual as he observed the child with his usual thoroughness. "Or are you in danger?" The boy said only, "I was told to find the man who sees what others miss." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A flattering reputation. Who told you?" The boy unwrapped the parcel with great care, revealing a small wooden box, polished but worn, its brass latch tarnished by time. He held it out to Holmes, who accepted it with curiosity. Inside the box lay a single item, a silver puzzle piece, roughly triangular, engraved with delicate filigree. Holmes tilted it under the lamplight. "Curious," he murmured. "From a larger hole, clearly. And yet—" He looked up sharply. "This is not your box, is it?" The boy shook his head. "Then whose?" The child's answer was whispered, but it made the hair rise on the back of my neck. "It belonged to the man in the red room." Holmes lowered the puzzle piece. "And what does the man in the red room do, my boy?" "He watches people who forget," came the strange reply. "And he waits for the last riddle to be spoken." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, one of those moments when words are unnecessary. We had heard odd things in our time, but something about the boy's utterance struck a dissonant chord. "What is your name?" I asked gently. But the boy only blinked, then turned his eyes back to Holmes. "He said you would understand." Holmes rose to his full height. "I intend to." "Watson, fetch the brandy. The child is chilled." By the time I returned with the glass and a blanket, Holmes had drawn a small notebook from the desk and was sketching the puzzle piece with rapid strokes. The boy sat in the armchair, watching Holmes with a quiet intensity that unnerved me. "I don't suppose you've seen this shape before?" Holmes asked, holding up the sketch. The boy tilted his head. "It's the last corner, the piece that was missing when the voice stopped." Holmes paused mid-stroke. "What voice?" For the first time, the boy's facade cracked. He blinked rapidly, then whispered, "She sang at night, in the music room, but the man in the red room didn't like it. He said riddles should be whispered, not sung." Holmes turned slowly to me. "Watson, how far is Beckenham from here?" "Beckenham?" I echoed, startled. "Roughly 10 miles, I'd say." Holmes nodded. "And it has a conservatory of some note, does it not?" "I believe so, attached to Langmere Hall." "Langmere Hall," Holmes repeated, tasting the words. "And you, my young friend, how did you come here tonight? Who brought you?" The boy's expression turned vague, almost dreamy. "A coach, with no name. The driver wore gloves made of rain." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. "We are dealing with something delicately veiled. Either the boy's mind has been tampered with, or someone means for him to speak only in riddles." He turned to me with decision. "We are going to Langmere Hall, Watson, tonight." "But surely not in this fog." "Yes," Holmes cut in, already reaching for his coat. "Especially in this fog. I believe that is the point." It was nearly midnight when we descended the stone steps of Baker Street and stepped into the choking mist that curled through the gaslit veins of London like some sentient wraith. Holmes had insisted the boy remain in our lodgings. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet and infinitely tolerant, was asked to sit with him. "He needs warmth more than questioning," Holmes had said with surprising softness, though I could see the steel behind his eyes. He was already constructing a scaffolding of logic, laying each beam with surgical precision. A cab was summoned with difficulty. The streets were deserted save for the occasional bobbing lantern of a constable, and the horse snorted warily as the fog thickened. Holmes said little during the journey, his arms folded tight across his chest, his gaze fixed beyond the smeared window, as if reading messages in the swirling vapour. "What do you know of Langmere Hall?" I asked, seeking clarity where there was none. "Enough," Holmes replied, his voice low. "A minor estate near Beckenham, formerly belonging to the Stratmore family. The patriarch, Lord Benedict Stratmore, passed away some 12 years ago. Since then, the property has changed hands thrice. Currently leased, I believe, to a reclusive gentleman of private means. But what piques my interest is the rumour, largely disregarded, of the estate's music room, more specifically, its acoustics." "Acoustics?" "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "It is said that even the softest note played in that room carries unnaturally through the east wing, as though the house itself were inclined to eavesdrop." "And the boy?" I asked. "Do you truly think he came from Langmere?" "I think he was sent," Holmes replied. "Whether from Langmere or merely near it remains to be seen. But make no mistake, Watson, someone meant for that child to find us. The silver puzzle piece, the riddles, the peculiar references to the man in the red room. It is a performance, certainly, but not without structure." The road to Beckenham was quiet. Even the clatter of the horses' hooves felt muffled, as though we were moving under water. After nearly an hour, the coachman pulled up beside a rusted iron gate, flanked by stone lions whose features had long since weathered into anonymous snarls. "Langmere Hall," the driver grunted, tipping his cap. Holmes alighted first, striding up the gravel path with purpose. I followed, noting the sickly scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted hinges or old blood. The hall loomed ahead, its outline blurred by fog, with a single flicker of lamplight visible on the upper floor. We were met at the door by a tall, thin man in a burgundy dressing gown and soft leather slippers. His hair was neatly parted, though silver ran thick through the black, and his eyes were the colour of wet ash. "Mr. Holmes," he said, before Holmes could speak. I had been expecting someone, though I confess I did not know it would be you. "You have me at a disadvantage," Holmes replied, his tone neutral. "My name is Merryweather. I am the current tenant of Langmere Hall." He paused, glancing at me. "And your associate, of course, Dr. Watson. You are both welcome, though I cannot imagine what has brought you to this place at such an hour." Holmes did not answer directly. "Might we come inside? The night has grown decidedly symbolic." Merryweather stepped aside, and we entered a hall that was grand yet melancholic, its once opulent details softened by dust and age. Portraits of unsmiling ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following us with solemn approval or suspicion. It was hard to say. "I assume you've heard no reports of missing children," Holmes said as we removed our outerwear. Merryweather's brow twitched. "Children? No, this is a quiet estate. I rarely entertain guests, and the grounds are patrolled, I assure."
"You, Mr. Holmes, if there had been a child wandering about—" "He would not have wandered," Holmes interrupted. "He would have been guided, or rather, delivered." We were shown into a drawing room lit by a single candelabrum. The shadows clung thick in the corners, and somewhere deeper in the house, a grandfather clock struck one, its chime unsettling in the silence. Holmes produced the silver puzzle piece from his pocket and held it between two fingers. "Do you recognize this?" Merryweather studied it without touching. "No," he said slowly, "though it resembles something, perhaps part of a child's toy." Holmes's smile was thin. "An incomplete puzzle, certainly, but not a child's. It is silver, hand-engraved, and bears markings consistent with the craftsmanship of Gunter and Blanche, a jeweller who, until recently, operated discreetly near St. James's." "A curious item to turn up in your house," I murmured. "Indeed," Holmes said, "especially when it arrives via a mute child in a soaked wool coat claiming it belonged to a man in the Red Room." Merryweather paled ever so slightly. "The Red Room?" "Yes," Holmes said lightly. "I presume you have such a place here?" Merryweather hesitated. "It's merely a library, one of the smaller rooms in the East Wing. The walls are crimson, but there is nothing remarkable about it." Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson, let us see this unremarkable chamber." We followed Merryweather down a long corridor lined with gilt-framed landscapes, each darker than the last. The East Wing, Holmes had mentioned earlier, was aligned with the music room. The very architecture seemed to grow colder with each step. When at last the Red Room's door opened, I felt a chill not from the air, but from something unspoken. The room was modest in size, but oddly shaped, six-sided, not square. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, and in the center sat a claw-footed desk, empty but for a black fountain pen and a sheaf of unused parchment. Holmes entered and stood motionless. "There is no dust on the desk," he said softly, "though the shelves have not been touched in months." Merryweather said nothing. Holmes then stepped to the far wall and pressed a hand against the panelling. "There is something behind this," he murmured. "Hollow. Watson, fetch my walking stick." I retrieved it from the hall, and Holmes tapped gently, then sharply. A portion of the panel gave way, revealing a recess no larger than a bread box. Inside was an envelope. A child's name written on the front, Elias. Holmes did not open it. Instead, he turned to Merryweather. "You are certain no child has ever lived here?" Merryweather's hands trembled slightly. "Not in this house," he said. "Not any more." Holmes tucked the envelope into his coat. "Then I believe, sir, that you have mistaken silence for safety." Back in the cab, the envelope bearing the name Elias lay in.
Holmes's gloved hand, unopened, untouched. He held it the way one might hold a dormant but venomous insect, calmly, but with absolute precision. The fog had not lifted. It wrapped itself round London as if to muffle its secrets, and even as the horses' hooves echoed faintly on the cobbled road back from Langmere Hall, a hush seemed to settle between us. "You're waiting?" I said at last. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Indeed! For what? He tapped the envelope against his fingertips. For the narrative to reveal whether it is fiction or confession. You think the letter was planted? I think it was meant to be found, Holmes replied. We were lured to Langmere with the precision of a chess move. Fog thick as smoke, a child speaking in symbols, a hidden cavity in a red-walled room. It is all curated. He paused, then added, and yet within that orchestration I detect something raw, something unplanned. You believe the letter to be genuine? I believe someone believed it should be hidden. That, Watson, is all the authenticity I require. He broke the seal with a neat tear. Inside was a single sheet of paper, rough-edged, creased, and written in an unsteady hand. Holmes read silently, his eyes darting with growing intensity. When at last he looked up, his expression had changed. Well? I asked. It is not a confession, he murmured, but a warning. He handed it to me. The writing was halting, almost childlike, as if the writer had paused after every few words. If someone finds this, Elias was not meant to stay. They said he would forget. But he remembers the song, and he says it backwards now. That is when the glass broke. They moved the mirror after that, but he still talks to it. He says the other side knows the riddles. The woman cries at night, please, if someone finds this, don't let them take the other children too. Unsigned. I read it twice, the second time more slowly, feeling the unease grow with every line. Good Lord, I muttered. Precisely, Holmes said. It is not the content alone, it is the implication of plurality, other children, and a reference to someone who cries at night. Likely the same she the boy referred to in Baker Street, a music room, a singer, and a mirror. He tapped the cab wall sharply. Change of destination, he called to the driver. Holborn, Gunter and Blanche, if it still stands. But surely not at this hour. I only need the building, not its owners. He turned back to me, already lost in thought. Holmes, I said, lowering my voice, you don't believe this child Elias is mad? Holmes gave me a look, both grave and oddly tender. Watson, madness is rarely poetic. It is cruel, noisy, and without symmetry. But this child, he speaks in verse. He observes patterns, he constructs metaphor. That is not madness. That is memory, trying not to forget. We arrived in Holborn just after 2, the streets deserted save for the flicker of an oil lamp still burning behind the shuttered jewellers. Holmes stepped down, crouched by the window, and studied the brass placard affixed to the door. Gunter and Blanche, makers of unique keepsakes and puzzle objects. 1852. Puzzle objects, Holmes murmured, smiling faintly. A dying art. He produced his magnifying lens and studied the lock. No signs of forced entry. They've likely not had cause for alarm in decades. And yet, I said, glancing around, you think this place may link to the puzzle piece? I don't think, Holmes replied. I see. He pointed to the edge of the placard where a faint engraving, nearly invisible, was scratched beneath the formal logo. SP12, I frowned. A serial number. A batch code. They produced puzzle sets in limited series, each unique. This one, I suspect, was bespoke. He scribbled the mark in his notebook. Come, this alone gives us a thread. We returned to Baker Street as dawn began to pry its grey fingers into the sky. Holmes moved at once to his files, dragging out a folder marked Special Commissions, Private Clients, 1892-1895. He flipped through correspondence with the careless speed of someone who knew precisely where to pause. Aha, he said at last, holding up a receipt. Commission SP12, custom puzzle box, silver filigree, engraving pattern matches. Who ordered it? Holmes's brow furrowed. No name listed, only a delivery address. He turned the slip toward me. ATN, Lady R.M. Wetherell, Chiswick House, London. Lady Wetherell, I repeated slowly. I've heard the name. Widowed young, wasn't she? Correct. Her husband, a naval officer, was lost in the Baltic. She disappeared from society shortly after. Some said she took in pupils for music. Others claimed she fell ill. He tapped the page. If the child Elias stayed with her, it might explain the music, the riddles, the mirror. You think she's the woman mentioned in the letter? Holmes closed the file. I think we must ask her ourselves. I was about to suggest rest before action, but Holmes was already donning his coat once more. Sleep, for him, was optional. Curiosity was not. Before we left, he paused by the fireplace and lifted the small puzzle piece once more. There's something melodic in this, he murmured. A note in silver. Not a toy, a key perhaps. A memory trapped in metal. He tucked it carefully into his pocket. Come, Watson, let us call on a recluse. It was 6:30 in the morning when we arrived in Chiswick, the air brittle with the early chill that rides just ahead of sunlight. The cab turned slowly through narrow residential lanes until it pulled before the rusted iron gate of a modest Georgian townhouse. A brass plate near the door bore the name Chiswick House, a touch grander than the home itself deserved, but not uncommon among those clinging to titles outliving their fortunes. Holmes alighted first, scrutinizing the windows with a gaze that seemed to cut through shutters and time alike. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly. I listened, tilting my head. "The wind?" No, he said. "Listen again." And then I caught it, faint, irregular, nearly swallowed by the stillness of morning, a piano, single notes, no melody, as though someone were testing each key to ensure it still spoke. We approached the front steps. Holmes rapped 3 times with the tip of his cane, sharp and deliberate. The music stopped. We waited in silence. Then came the soft shuffle of feet, and the door opened just a crack. A woman's face appeared in the shadow, pale, drawn, and framed by dishevelled grey hair that had once been carefully pinned. Her eyes flicked between us warily, and her voice, when it came, was no louder than parchment against stone. "I don't receive callers." Holmes tipped his hat. "Then permit me to be an interruption, Lady Wetherell." Her expression froze. "I've not used that name in years." "Forgive the presumption," Holmes said, "but I fear this is not a social call." She hesitated, then opened the door fully and stepped back. "Come in. If this is about the boy—" Holmes entered before she could finish, his face unreadable. I followed, noting the faded wallpaper, the mismatched chairs, the sense of a home long closed to sunlight and fresh air. The air smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs with a lingering trace of candle smoke. She gestured us into a sitting room whose furnishings told a story of refinement worn down by sorrow. A piano sat in the corner, its lid open, ivory keys stained with age. Upon the mantel rested a music box shaped like a swan, and beside it an old photograph turned face down. Holmes approached it immediately. "May I?" She gave a reluctant nod. He turned the frame. The image was of a boy, perhaps 8 or 9, seated beside a much younger Lady Wetherell. The child's expression was serene, but his eyes were unmistakable, wide, dark, and knowing. "Elias," I murmured. She sat down heavily in an armchair. "You've met him." "He came to Baker Street," Holmes said gently, bearing a puzzle piece and a parcel, speaking in riddles. "He said you used to sing." She closed her eyes. "I did. He used to listen from the corridor. He would never enter until the last note. Then he'd ask what it meant, as though music had a secret. Holmes sat across from her. And did it? She opened her eyes, and for the first time I saw not just grief, but defiance. Of course it did. Music is memory. It hides what the tongue cannot speak. Where is he now? I asked softly. I don't know, she whispered. They took him. Holmes leaned forward. Who? She hesitated, then replied with something between dread and disgust. The ones who funded his schooling. Patrons, they called themselves. They came with contracts and papers and talked about gifts. They said Elias was special, said he had a mind like a prism. Did you sign anything? I refused, but they didn't need my consent. Elias was, he was not mine by law. Holmes glanced at me, then back at her. You took him in? She nodded. 6 years ago? He was left at the steps of St. Nicholas's orphanage, wrapped in red wool with no note. They sent him to me because of my music, said perhaps it would soothe him. But Elias didn't need soothing. He needed silence. Why? She hesitated again. Because he spoke to the mirror. Holmes's eyes lit faintly, but he let her continue. He would sit before the one in the music room, the tall one, brass-framed, and murmur to it. At first, I thought it was an imaginary friend. But then he began answering questions I hadn't asked, details from my past, names I'd not spoken aloud in years. Do you believe he was clairvoyant? I asked carefully. She shook her head. I don't know, but he frightened people. The nuns, the physicians, even me at times. And then, about 3 months ago, he began speaking backwards. Backwards? Full sentences, perfectly inverted, and not gibberish, poems, riddles, references to things I hadn't taught him, ancient things. Holmes stood abruptly and paced once. Lady Wetherell, did you ever notice symbols, geometric markings especially, drawn by Elias, circles, triangles, perhaps lines within squares? Her mouth parted in surprise. Yes, he would draw them in chalk on the floor beneath the mirror, always the same pattern, a square with a missing corner. Holmes retrieved the puzzle piece from his coat pocket and held it out. Like this? She gasped. That's one of his. He called it the silence key. Said it would fit the room when it was quiet enough to be heard. Holmes exhaled slowly, turning the piece over in his hand. He's describing resonance, Watson. Not sound, but memory. A room that listens instead of echoes. Lady Wetherell shuddered. They said he had a gift, but I think he was remembering something he hadn't lived. Do you recall who took him? She nodded. 3 men. 1 wore grey gloves. 1 carried a cane. And the 3rd never spoke. Elias called him the man who smiles when no one's laughing. Holmes turned sharply to me. That matches the boy's earlier riddle. He returned to her. Did they give a name? Only initials. The Harrow Group. They claimed to be involved in psychological research. I haven't seen Elias since. Holmes moved to the window and stared out at the waking street. I believe you may have been the last kind hand in the boy's life. She rose, trembling slightly. If he's in danger. He's already crossed the threshold of it, Holmes said. Our task is to prevent him from vanishing into it entirely. He turned. To me, jaw set. We must trace this Harrow Group, every registry, every medical society, every shadowed grant in the name of research. Elias was taken because someone believes he remembers something they need hidden. And the puzzle piece? I asked. Holmes held it up to the morning light. The first note in a song not yet sung. It was not yet 10 when we returned to Baker Street, though the day already felt twice lived. Holmes discarded his coat in a heap upon the armchair and moved to the hearth with the focus of a man reconstructing the world in his mind. The morning fire sputtered. Mrs. Hudson had, in her habitual silence, replenished it before our return. The boy, Elias, was still asleep upstairs. She had laid him on the settee in the spare room and left a bowl of barley broth cooling by the sill. Holmes did not so much glance at him. Instead, he reached for the thick volume of the London Medical Register and heaved it onto the desk with a thud that made the fire hiss. "Watson," he said, flipping pages with a kind of orchestral fury, "you are aware, of course, that most fringe medical societies, even the more eccentric ones, maintain filings with the College of Physicians?" "Yes," I replied, pulling a second ledger from the shelf behind him. "Though often in name only, many operate under aliases or charitable fronts." "Precisely," Holmes said, "which is why we're looking for echoes, not titles." For the better part of an hour, the only sound in the room was the rustling of paper and the occasional murmur from Elias upstairs. I paused once to listen, but it was nothing more than the dream mutterings of a child half submerged in sleep. Yet even in slumber his words held a pattern, a rhythm not unlike verse. I jotted them down as they came. The mirror sees the breath before the mouth. The mouth speaks the name before the thought. The thought hides the riddle in the wall. Holmes read it over my shoulder and nodded faintly. "There's geometry in that." Then, abruptly, he froze. His finger landed on a thin column halfway down a yellowed page. "Here." I leaned over to read Harrow Institute of Neurological Inquiry, founded 1884, Director Dr. Silas Fenley, MD, FRCP, Field, Abnormal Cognition, Applied Mnemonics, Trauma-Linked Speech, Patterns, Funding Private Fellowship, Undisclosed Fenley, I said aloud. The name rings oddly, not from practice, but from somewhere darker. Holmes was already scribbling notes. He was expelled from St. Bartholomew's 20 years ago for unauthorized experimentation on memory retention in post-trauma children. Supposedly disavowed the medical community, yet here he resurfaces under the umbrella of neurological inquiry, a far more fashionable euphemism than cognitive manipulation. I felt a chill run through me. And he's behind this Harrow group? Not definitively, Holmes replied, but his institute shares its name, and in my experience, such coincidences rarely survive examination. He stood and crossed to the fireplace, holding the puzzle piece up against the flickering light. This, Watson, is not merely symbolic. It is a calibration key. To what? To memory, or rather, to how it is stored, shaped, retrieved. He turned it over slowly. The symmetry, the weight, the material, all suggest intentional construction, not a game, a device. But for whom? I asked. For someone like Elias, he said. Someone whose mind stores information not as language but as code, symbols, shapes, riddles. Someone who remembers differently, and someone Fenley likely sees not as a child, but as a tool. We left the house shortly after noon, Holmes having written a curt but effective letter of inquiry to the College of Physicians, requesting any known contacts or associations connected to Fenley. He posted it himself, then hailed a cab bound for Clerkenwell. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching the fog begin to gather once more above the chimney stacks. "To a man named Alwyn Druitt," Holmes said. "Former medical archivist at the college, retired now, but he was responsible for approving institutional status for Harrow in 1884. If anyone knows who truly funded it, he will." Clerkenwell was quieter than usual, the early gloom of an overcast afternoon keeping most indoors. Druitt lived in a terraced house opposite a weaver's shop, the windows shuttered but the curtains moving faintly within. He opened the door himself after Holmes knocked, an elderly man in a heavy wool cardigan and thick spectacles, with a librarian's hands and a throat perpetually half-cleared. "Sherlock Holmes," he said at once. "You've a reputation for arriving before the ink dries." Holmes inclined his head. "I've come to ask about an institute you once approved, Harrow." Druitt did not invite us in, but neither did he close the door. He simply stood in the frame, blinking. "You've got the right ghost. I signed it in '84. "Who funded it?" Holmes asked directly. Druitt hesitated, his eyes flitting toward the hallway behind him. "Well, it wasn't public. But not criminal, I trust." A long pause. Then, "Not exactly." Holmes waited. At last, Druitt said, "It came from the Spindle Trust." I frowned. "Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," he replied. "It was a short-lived philanthropic shell, existed for precisely 13 months. Their aim was memory rehabilitation and youth cognition in post-industrial trauma. But the language was odd, very vague, more like someone pretending to sound scientific." "Who signed the trust charter?" Holmes pressed. Druitt glanced around and stepped back, lowering his voice. "I remember only the initials. EMD. They never use names, just initials, on the financials. But there was always one gentleman who delivered the documents by hand, thin fellow, grey gloves." Holmes's face darkened. "He's been mentioned before." Druitt shuddered. "They weren't scientists, Mr. Holmes. They were collectors of minds, children, mostly. They believed certain memories could be extracted and preserved." "Like specimens," I said, grimly. Druitt nodded. "They called it the riddle organ. Said it lived behind the eyes. That if a child had seen something he didn't understand, some trauma, some shape, he might store it like a secret, one they could harvest when the child was old enough to speak it." There was a long, cold silence. "And where is the institute now?" Holmes asked softly. "Gone," Druitt whispered. "Dissolved in '89. Officially it burned. But I've always suspected otherwise." Holmes nodded once, then stepped back. "Thank you. You've told us more than you should have." Druitt gave a sad smile. "And less than you'll need." Back in the cab, Holmes was quiet, but it was not the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of alignment, the moment a puzzle begins to take shape from its scattered pieces. "So," I said at last. "What now?" He turned to me, eyes alight. "Now we find the mirror." "The mirror?" Holmes tapped his cane once against the floorboard. "Everything returns to it. Elias spoke to it. The woman cried before it. And somewhere behind it, something was hidden." I frowned. "But the Red Room was searched." "Not by me," Holmes said grimly. "We returned to Langmere tonight." Night had fallen hard by the time we reached Langmere Hall again, this time unannounced, uninvited, and unaccompanied. Holmes had insisted we arrive late, after supper, after the servants had retired, after the respectable world had retreated into its dreams. Fog hung low and impenetrable across the fields, swirling in long fingers across the gravel drive like something sentient. The house itself looked darker than it had on our first visit. Only a single dim lamp burned behind the high windows of the east wing, the Red Room, we suspected. It flickered faintly as if not entirely real. Holmes motioned for silence and approached the side door, where a covered portico shielded a disused servant's entrance. With a practised twist of his wrist and a sliver of flattened metal drawn from his inner coat, the lock gave way in seconds. "You've improved your technique," I whispered. "I've had reason to," he murmured, pushing the door open. Inside, the air was dense with neglect and something older, a coppery smell, not quite blood, not quite rust. Holmes pulled a lantern from his satchel and lit it with a match, shielding the flame with his palm as we moved through the narrow service corridor. The house did not creak. It listened. We reached the Red Room in minutes. Its door opened without protest, as though it had been waiting. The lamplight flickered against the crimson walls, turning the room into a cavern of silent warmth. The mirror stood where we had last seen it, tall, brass-framed, its surface clean, but not gleaming. The bookshelves still towered, unread and unmoved. Holmes stepped to the centre of the room and exhaled slowly. "There's a pressure here," he said, "like a bell that's just finished ringing." I felt it too, a sort of hum, like a presence had only just departed. He turned to me. "Fetch the candlestick from the mantel." I obeyed. Holmes took it, lit it from the lantern, and placed it directly before the mirror. Then he stood behind it, eyes narrowed. "Note the flame, Watson?" I did. It danced steadily at first, then trembled, not from a breeze, but from a vibration I could not see. "There's a draught," I said. "Not quite," Holmes replied. "Watch the base." He knelt and ran his fingers lightly along the mirror's bottom edge, pressing against the mahogany stand with precise taps. Then, with a click so soft I nearly missed it, a narrow seam opened beneath the frame, less a drawer than a concealed channel. From it, Holmes withdrew a second puzzle piece. It was identical in style to the one Elias had brought to Baker Street, silver, engraved, triangular, but this one bore a different pattern, a lattice of lines intersecting at a single broken star. He held it up, letting the two pieces rest in his palm side by side. "Two corners of the same whole," he murmured, "the square with the missing centre." I felt the hairs rise on my neck. "A map?" "Possibly," Holmes said, "or a schematic, a design encoded into metaphor." He turned the mirror now, not its surface, but the frame itself, and examined the brass bolts where the structure met the wall. "It's not just decorative," he muttered. "It's fixed with industrial screws, and see here, scratches near the base, as though it's been moved, repeatedly. But never freely." He stepped back and scanned the room, then turned slowly in place, his eyes flitting across the corners. "Watson, recall Lady Wetherell's words. He called it the silence key, said it would fit the room when it was quiet enough to be heard." She meant metaphorically, surely. "With Elias, nothing is merely metaphor," Holmes said. He dimmed the lantern, allowing the shadows to reclaim most of the room. Only the mirror's reflection remained lit by the lone candlestick. We waited in silence, and then a sound, faint, a click. Holmes rushed to the mirror, placing his hand flat against the wall just to its left. "There," he whispered. "A hollow segment, but not a drawer, something vertical." He drew a slender chisel from his satchel and inserted it along the seam in the wainscoting. With a gentle twist, a panel popped free. Behind it lay a vertical cavity, barely wide enough for a hand, and inside, folded with exquisite care, was a sheaf of parchment. Not paper, vellum. Holmes opened it with the delicacy of a man unwrapping a confession. Etched into the surface were symbols, not words, a sequence of geometric forms in rows, circles with missing segments, interlocking hexagrams, crosses within squares. Each one had a corresponding number beneath, sometimes inverted, sometimes scratched out. Holmes exhaled. "It's a cipher." "To what?" He gave a bleak smile. "To whatever memory Elias stored here." He ran a finger along the top row. "This is not the child's hand. This was written by an adult, and not Lady Wetherell." "Then who?" I asked. "Someone with knowledge of pattern-based neurology, mnemonic encoding, perhaps someone from the Harrow Group." He traced one particular glyph, a triangle with one broken edge and a single eye in its center. "This appears in Mesopotamian scripture, in early Greek numerology, and," he tapped it again, "in the window of the old music room at Langmere. I saw it etched faintly into the glass on our last visit." I blinked. You never mentioned that. I hadn't deciphered it yet, Holmes replied. But now I know it's not random. It's a marker, an echo, something Elias saw, or was shown and remembered in riddles. I felt a slow dread begin to coil in my chest. Holmes, this isn't merely about memory, is it? Someone was trying to implant something in him. Holmes nodded gravely, or retrieve something he was born remembering. The room fell silent again. Then 3 knocks, not loud, not rushed, but perfectly spaced, from upstairs. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. We had made certain the house was empty. He extinguished the candlestick and retrieved the parchment, tucking it into his coat. "Bring the mirror," he whispered. I hesitated. "It's heavy." "Precisely. They will not expect us to move it." As he turned toward the corridor, I took hold of the side handles and tilted the mirror gently. It groaned, ancient and resistant, but it gave way. We slipped out of the red room, past the sleeping portraits, and down the servant stair. Another knock, this time not above, but below, from the cellar. Holmes froze, then leaned in. "We're not alone here, Watson." I gripped the mirror with both hands. "Then we find out who is." The mirror was heavy in my grip, and its brass fittings rattled with every breath I took. Holmes led the way, lantern held low, his steps unnaturally silent on the boards. The knock had come from below, 3 slow raps echoing through the bones of Langmere Hall like a summons or a warning. Holmes paused at the threshold of the servants' stairwell. "You heard it, Watson?" I nodded. "Clear as a pistol crack, and twice as unsettling." "The cellar entrance is beneath the scullery," Holmes said. "We passed it earlier, a locked door disguised behind a cupboard." "Locked from this side?" I asked. "I suspect not. The builders of houses like these preferred subtlety over safety. Come." We descended carefully, the mirror still tilted between us. My arms ached beneath its weight, but I dared not protest. It no longer felt like a piece of furniture. It felt like an instrument, like a key that had not yet found the door it belonged to. The scullery was pitch black. Holmes set the lantern on a high shelf and moved the cupboard aside with effort. Behind it, just as he'd predicted, lay a narrow wooden door with a brass knob dulled by age. He tried it. It turned with a quiet sigh and opened into darkness. The scent hit us at once, damp, old stone, mildew, and something beneath it, not rot, not decay, something colder, preserved. Holmes turned to me. No words now, only eyes. We stepped inside. The passage sloped downward, the stone walls curving in slightly, like the throat of some vast and sleeping beast. The ceiling was low enough to brush the top of Holmes's head, and the air tightened with every step. We descended perhaps 30 feet before reaching the base of the cellar, where the space widened suddenly into a rounded chamber. And there, in the dim lamplight, I saw them. Mirrors. Not furniture, not decoration, fixtures. 5 of them arranged in a loose semicircle against the far wall, each identical in size to the one we carried, brass-framed, unmarked, each facing inward, as though waiting to bear witness. In the center stood a raised platform, its surface inlaid with circular grooves, like a phonograph, but wider, stranger. Holmes whispered, "A resonance chamber." "For music?" I asked. "For memory," he replied. "Or for something they believed memory could unlock." He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. I remained near the threshold, mirror still gripped tightly in my hands, afraid to set it down, afraid it might somehow join its brothers unbidden. Holmes examined the platform, running his hand along its edge. "These grooves aren't decorative. They match the geometric cipher we recovered. See, here and here. Broken stars, triangular ports. This is meant to align with something." He turned back to me. Bring the mirror? I hesitated. Holmes, are we sure this isn't a trap? He smiled faintly. Of course it's a trap, but not ours. I swallowed my protest and brought the mirror forward. Holmes helped me set it into a curved slot on the outer edge of the platform. As it clicked into place, a soft hum filled the chamber, low and harmonic, like a bowed string vibrating just below hearing. Holmes froze. So, he said, the system remains active. System? He stepped to the opposite side and examined one of the fixed mirrors, then another. Each bore, upon close inspection, a sliding track near its base, meant to adjust the angle. They're not meant to reflect the observer, Holmes said. They're meant to reflect each other, to form a loop, a closed optical field. I shivered. For what purpose? He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw doubt in his expression. I don't know. Then came the second sound, a soft creak from the stair above. We both turned. A figure stood there, half-shadowed, tall, thin, motionless. He wore a charcoal coat and gloves so pale they nearly glowed. His face was obscured by the lantern's glare behind him, but I knew by instinct alone that we had met one of the men Elias had described. Holmes stepped forward, one hand slipping into his coat. "You've come for the mirror," he said. The figure said nothing. "I assure you," Holmes went on, "we've treated it with care, but you left something else behind, didn't you? A child, one who remembers more than you intended." The man descended 2 steps. Holmes withdrew his pistol. "Not another inch." The figure paused. Then from above, another sound. Light footsteps. Smaller. "Elias," I whispered. The boy appeared behind the figure, standing not beside him, but behind, unnoticed. His eyes were wide and shining, and in his hands he carried the 3rd puzzle piece. "Give it to him," Holmes said calmly. "Now." The boy didn't move. Instead, he stepped sideways, just enough for the light to strike his face. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the mirrors. And he was smiling. Without a word, Elias crossed the threshold and moved to the center of the platform. He bent down and placed the puzzle piece into the groove at the center. It clicked. The hum intensified. Each of the mirrors shuddered. Holmes shouted, "Watson, cover your eyes!" I did, and in that instant a blinding light burst outward from the center, reflecting from mirror to mirror in a perfect loop. The entire chamber filled with a noise not loud but deep, a resonance that passed through the body like cold wind through bone. Then silence. I opened my eyes. The chamber was empty. The man with the gloves was gone. So was Elias. Only the mirror remained, dark, inert, and once again just glass. Holmes stood in the center, motionless. Then he turned to me, eyes distant. "They didn't take him," he said softly. He called them. We stood in the red-lit silence of the cellar, both of us staring at the platform where moments ago a boy had vanished into light. Holmes had not moved. His hand still clutched the now silent lantern, but he no longer seemed aware of it. His eyes, usually so active and calculating, were fixed not on any one point, but somewhere far beyond the room, as if trying to trace the light that had disappeared. I approached slowly. "Holmes," I said, "what happened?" He didn't answer. His breath had slowed, but the taut line of his jaw and the tight press of his mouth told me the question wasn't lost on him. It was simply premature. I waited, the air thick with something I could not name. Not dust, not smoke. Something more akin to presence. Finally, he spoke. "There is no mechanism beneath the platform," he said flatly. "No trapdoor, no sliding panel, no physical retreat." "You're certain?" I examined the grooves myself, Watson. The piece Elias placed wasn't a key to an opening. It was a signal. A signal to whom? Holmes knelt beside the platform, running his fingers along the place where the 3 puzzle pieces had been joined. The grooves remained, but the centre of the surface was now scorched, just slightly, discoloured as if a heatless fire had bloomed there and died. He turned to the mirror we had brought down. Its surface was no longer reflective. Instead, it was clouded with a filmy grey sheen like the cooled surface of Mercury. Holmes wiped at it with his cuff, but the fog would not lift. "It's been used," he muttered. "Whatever function it once served, communication, projection, alignment, it has completed its role, and it will not repeat." I knelt beside him. "But Elias, he was real, Holmes. We both saw him." Holmes nodded once. "He was not an apparition." "Then where is he?" Holmes stood. "Gone." "Gone where?" He turned toward me, and I was startled to find something in his expression that I had not seen in many years, not since the Reichenbach Falls. "I don't know," he said. Those words hung between us. Holmes hated them. He used them rarely. And only when the full shape of an idea had formed but refused to be seen in daylight. This was not defeat. This was the storm wall before the leap. We returned to the surface, the mirror left behind. Holmes locked the cellar door and replaced the cupboard in silence. The hall above was still, and Langmere Hall seemed untouched by the incident. No alarms, no movement from upstairs, no hint that time had moved at all. We left by the side door once more and took a cab back to Baker Street under a clouded moon. The morning passed without speech. Holmes did not pace or play the violin or thumb through his archive. He simply sat by the window, eyes fixed on the city below. I brought him tea, which went untouched. At length he spoke. Elias spoke backwards. I nodded, unsure what thread he had picked up. "He spoke backwards not because he couldn't speak forward," Holmes said, voice low, "but because backward was where the truth resided." "You mean metaphorically?" I asked. "No," he said, and then turned to me. The Harrow Group believed the mind could retain images, shapes, impressions, codes, that the conscious brain could not translate. But under certain conditions, trauma, rhythm, mirror loop feedback, the subconscious would reverse the encoding, speak it aloud, disguise it as nonsense. And Elias was the decoder. Holmes stood abruptly. They built him to be the receiver of something they could not see. And the mirrors, those were the antennae. "You think this was all intentional?" "I think," Holmes said, walking to his desk, "that Langmere Hall was never meant to be a home. It was a laboratory. The Red Room was the calibration chamber, the cellar a transmission node. They were trying to create a psychic echo, a way to hear something older than memory." He opened the folded vellum cipher from his coat and spread it on the desk. Then, from the drawer, he retrieved the 2 remaining puzzle pieces. "These are not keys, they are coordinates." I stepped forward. "Coordinates to what?" Holmes tapped the vellum. "Each shape corresponds to a memory signature, and each puzzle piece matches a harmonic value. Think of it like sound waves translated into geometry. Elias was the tuning fork. When he completed the sequence, the circuit closed. And the light? Holmes stared at it for a long moment. A side effect, or perhaps the true purpose. He drew in a slow breath, then returned to the cipher, cross-referencing the puzzle engravings with the glyphs on the vellum. "Watson, I need you to find something for me," he said suddenly. "Anything. Go to the British Museum, manuscript room, ask for the Parmenides Scrolls section on pre-Platonic harmonics. Look for the phrase, 'The broken square contains the mirrored eye.' It should be in a marginal notation from the 3rd century translation." I blinked. And what precisely are we looking for? A precedent, he said. If this has been done before, the answer won't be in a police file. It will be in myth, ritual, musicology. I donned my coat and left without further questions, trusting that the strands in Holmes's mind would eventually braid themselves into clarity. He had entered that dangerous state of hyperfocus I had seen only a few times before, the kind that often yielded brilliance, but sometimes came at a cost. I returned 3 hours later, damp from the rain, with a folder of copied texts. The phrase existed as Holmes predicted, scribbled in the margin of a translation of Fragment 18 of Parmenides. The broken square contains the mirrored eye. To speak is to forget, to echo is to remember. Below it, in another hand, was a short annotation in faded Latin, used in rites to retrieve the thoughts of the dead, said to summon what was never living but always listening. I handed the sheet to Holmes. He read it, then again, then folded it in half. "There it is," he said softly. "What?" "The riddle in reverse." The light rain had turned to a misty drizzle by the time Holmes roused himself from the study chair and returned to motion. The fire had long since gone to embers, and the mirror Elias had brought, now lifeless, stood propped against the wall in the corner of our sitting room, a relic of something that should not have existed. Holmes took one last glance at the folded vellum cipher on the desk, then snapped it shut inside a lacquered case and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. "We're being watched," he said suddenly without turning. I stiffened. "You're certain?" He nodded. 3 times in the last hour a shadow crossed the street outside and lingered beyond the corner gas lamp. Same silhouette, same stride, the same man who stood in the stairwell at Langmere. He followed us back. Why not confront him? "Because, Watson," Holmes said, retrieving his revolver from the drawer and sliding it into his coat, "we no longer chase phantoms, we invite them." He strode to the corner and tapped the mirror gently. "This is our bait." "You mean to set a trap?" "Not merely a trap," he said. "A resonance." "I don't follow." He turned to me with that flicker of delighted mischief in his eyes, an expression I hadn't seen since the days of our earliest adventures. "I believe Elias did not vanish into the mirror. He activated a circuit, closed a loop. The light we saw was not a departure, but a reflection of something returning." He gestured to the cipher, now tucked in his coat. If the original chamber at Langmere Hall was designed to complete the loop, 6 mirrors, 3 puzzle pieces, 1 child, then it stands to reason that a partial echo could be triggered with only a fragment of the design, enough to draw attention, enough to draw them. "And them," I said, "would be?" Holmes looked grim. "The Harrow Group, or whatever remnant of it remains. They believe Elias holds something, an encoded memory, a sequence, a key not to a place but to a thought. They lost him once, now they know he's stirred the circuit again." He knelt beside the mirror and adjusted the angle slightly, tilting it toward the open fireplace so the glass reflected not the room, but the flickering shadows of the coals. "Watson," he said without looking up, "you must write a letter." "To whom?" "Lady Wetherell." "She's in danger?" "No," he said, "but she's necessary." It took the better part of the evening to prepare the room. Holmes insisted on lighting only 3 candles, placed equidistantly around the mirror, replicating, as he put it, the minimum symmetry required to suggest completion. He marked faint chalk lines across the rug, aligning them with the angles on the puzzle pieces, then laid the final remaining piece directly beneath the mirror's base. The lights were extinguished. The mirror began to hum. I felt it first in my chest, barely a vibration, more like an intuition. The air in the sitting room grew heavy, not in pressure, but in expectation. I had the distinct feeling we were no longer alone, though no sound nor movement betrayed the presence of any other. Holmes stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the mirror. Then 3 knocks. This time, not from below or above, but from within. The sound echoed from the mirror itself. Holmes did not flinch. "He's coming." "Elias?" I whispered. "No," Holmes said, "the one who watches." The knock came again, followed by a soft scraping sound like leather on glass. The mirror darkened slightly at its center, forming a shape, indistinct but vaguely human. It moved behind the surface as though behind smoke. Then a voice, not spoken, but present, inside the skull. "You've broken the loop," Holmes answered calmly. "Only bent it." "He is incomplete. The host must return." "I won't permit it." The voice lingered. "You cannot keep the mind from the mirror. What is seen is shared. What is shared is stored." Holmes stepped closer. "Elias was never your instrument. He remembers you. That makes him dangerous." "He is us." Holmes leaned down and took the puzzle piece from the base. "I disagree." He snapped it in 2. A low scream filled the room, not a sound in the ears but in the teeth, in the blood. I dropped to one knee, clenching my jaw. The candles blew out at once, and the mirror shattered. Not explosively, silently, as if it had turned to dust between one breath and the next. When I rose, the mirror was gone. Only ash remained where it had stood. We did not speak for several minutes. Finally, Holmes turned to me, pale but composed. "That was not a person." "No," I said, "it was a presence." He nodded. "A residue, a consciousness, fragmented and preserved, held in suspension by mirrors and minds and riddles." I sat heavily in my chair. "What happens now?" Holmes returned to the desk and retrieved the lacquered cipher case. He opened it, examined the vellum once more, then placed the broken puzzle piece within and sealed it. We wait. For Elias? For what remains of him, the part they couldn't take? And if they come again? He looked at me sharply. Then we end it, completely. The letter from Lady Wetherell arrived the next morning. It was short, no more than a page, written in a hurried, spidery hand. "Mr. Holmes," he returned, just after midnight, in the music room, but he would not speak. He only watched the window, as though waiting for someone to answer. He left again before I could ask where he had been. But he left this under the mirror. I believe you'll know what to do with it. RMW folded inside. The note was the final corner of the cipher parchment, previously torn away. It bore the last glyph, a broken square with a single open eye in the center, and beneath it a phrase in Elias's slanted, childlike handwriting. "The eye sees what the mirror forgets." Holmes placed it gently atop the others, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Now we begin." The rain returned in sheets that night, washing the gaslit streets in a wavering sheen of gold and grey. The mirror was gone, destroyed, dispersed, or perhaps never truly real in the conventional sense. And yet the boy had returned, not with fanfare, not with warning, but briefly and silently, like a thread drawn back into the tapestry before the pattern could fray. Holmes paced, not aimlessly, never aimlessly, but with a deliberation that made the very air of the sitting room feel laden with invisible calculations. He had placed all 5 puzzle pieces on the desk, arranged like compass points around the complete vellum cipher. Though one piece remained broken, the alignment still formed a discernible shape, a square missing one corner, the broken star at its center. He left it beneath the mirror, Holmes said quietly, reading and rereading Lady Wetherell's note. But it was never meant for her. "It was meant for you," I said. "For me, or for someone like me." Someone capable of interpreting the mirror rather than fearing it. He turned to the fireplace. They built Langmere Hall as an auditory chamber, a soundless one. The design was too exact, each room an echo chamber, each window shaped to distort reflection just so. It wasn't a house, it was a conduit. For memory? For information, Holmes corrected. Information remembered too early. I frowned. I still don't quite follow. He turned, his voice low. Watson, what if Elias wasn't the subject of their experiments, but the outcome? What if he wasn't a boy who stumbled into riddles, but one created to hold them? The idea chilled me. You mean engineered? Holmes nodded slowly. Born but selected, nurtured within a pattern, raised in rhythm, taught to encode the unspoken. He wasn't speaking backwards for drama, he was reciting a code, one only interpretable when reversed. And the Harrow Group. They were seeking access. They built the mirrors to reflect consciousness, Watson. Not light, not sound, but thought. He tapped the cipher once. This parchment isn't a message, it's a lock. And Elias was the only one who ever carried the key. I stared at the paper, its inky glyphs now appearing more alive than ornamental. So what's the final move? I asked. They know you've disrupted the mirror. They've lost the chamber. They'll retreat. Hide. Holmes shook his head. No, they've come too far. They'll do what all desperate minds do when cornered. They'll return to the origin. Precisely. Holmes reached for his coat. Langmere Hall. I blinked. Again. This time to finish it. The cab dropped us at the gate just after midnight. The rain had slowed, reduced now to a gentle pattering mist. The house loomed ahead like a sleeping giant with too many eyes, its upper windows still empty, dark but far from lifeless. Holmes carried nothing but his cane and a slim leather folder tucked under one arm. "I've sent word ahead," he said. "To Lady Wetherell?" He shook his head. "To Lestrade." I raised an eyebrow. "We're involving Scotland Yard?" "No, we're not. But they'll want to be present when what remains of the Harrow Group is caught red-handed trespassing on private property." We stepped through the same servant entrance once more, but Holmes did not lead us toward the Red Room or the scullery stair. He turned, instead, toward the West Corridor, a wing we had never explored. "Where are we going?" "To the True Mirror," Holmes said. "The prototype. The one built before they split it into 6, the original alignment device." I followed in silence, noting how the corridor walls became more ornate as we went. The woodwork was heavier here, the ceilings higher. And then, at the far end, we found it, a locked door of dark oak with a brass handle cold to the touch. Holmes inserted a key, one I hadn't seen him pocket, and turned it slowly. Inside was a circular room, domed above, its walls completely lined with dark glass. Not decorative mirrors, no gilt, no ornament, just seamless panes, edge to edge, surrounding the room in a perfect obsidian ring. In the center sat a single chair, small, wooden, child-sized, facing inward. Holmes lit a single lantern and placed it on the floor, casting flickering shadows that seemed to warp and contract across the mirrored surfaces. "This," he said softly, "was the first." I stepped forward cautiously. My own reflection stared back at me from all sides, multiplied, distorted. Every motion I made seemed to occur a split second too late. The reflections lagged. "Holmes," I said quietly. "The mirrors." "They're not just glass," he said. "They're coated with a rare mercury-nickel alloy developed in Prussia, designed to delay light response by fractional seconds." "Why?" "To test cognition, reflex, perception. When a child sits in the center of the room and sees their own movements reflected incorrectly, the mind begins to break the laws of its own expectations. And in that break, a window opens. I turned. "A window to what?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "That's what they were trying to find out. But they never sat in the chair themselves. Elias did. And he remembered what came through. There was a sound then, not a footstep, a shift as though the house itself had breathed." Holmes turned to me. "Stay behind the chair, and don't speak unless I speak first." The door creaked open behind us. 2 figures entered. One was the man with the grey gloves, the other a tall, severe woman with silver hair twisted into a chignon, her eyes sharp, analytical. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "we had hoped you might understand." Holmes gestured around the mirrored room. "This is your cathedral." "It's a listening chamber," the woman said. "It hears thought." "Then you must have heard this," Holmes replied, pulling the folder from his coat and tossing it to the floor. It flipped open, revealing the cipher, the broken square, the mirrored eye, the star. The woman's expression changed. "You've completed it," Holmes nodded, "and I've encoded it. In a location neither of you can retrieve without revealing yourselves. Scotland Yard is minutes away. The moment I send a signal, your operation collapses. You wouldn't dare." "I don't bluff," Holmes said. "I deduce. You've already lost the boy. He gave you the final glyph, then destroyed the circuit. You're grasping at reflections." The man with the gloves stepped forward. But Holmes raised a hand. "If you lay a finger on me, the code goes to every paper in London, translated." The woman paused. Then, surprisingly, smiled. "You're clever, Mr. Holmes, but even you cannot stop what's already begun." Holmes stepped closer. "Then give me a reason to let you walk out of here." The woman reached into her coat and tossed something toward the floor. A silver triangle. The final piece. Not Elias's, hers. "Because," she said, "you'll want to see what this one remembers." The final piece lay between us on the floor of the mirror chamber, silver, sharp-edged, and humming with the same faint resonance we had heard in Langmere Hall's depths. Even before Holmes stooped to retrieve it, I sensed it was not an ordinary object. It radiated a kind of static stillness, as though it were suspended in time, waiting to be remembered. Holmes picked it up, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. His expression was unreadable, but his brow furrowed with something deeper than calculation. Caution, perhaps. Or awe. "This isn't from Elias," he said without looking up. "No," the woman replied coolly. "It was crafted before he was born." Holmes turned the piece over in his palm. "The same engraver, Gunter and Blanche, but this alloy's composition is older, duller at the edges, worn not by touch, but by use." He stepped to the center of the room, now filled with the faint flicker of candlelight and our multiplied reflections. I remained behind him, watching both Holmes and the 2 intruders from a narrow corner where my image fractured infinitely across the glass. The man with the gloves remained near the door, arms folded, as silent as ever. But the woman stepped forward, her voice low and measured. "You don't yet see the full pattern, do you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not turn. "I see enough to know that Elias was never your goal. He was your conduit." "To whom?" I asked. Holmes answered for her. "To a memory that doesn't belong to him." The woman's lips twitched, almost to smile. "Very good." "You were never searching for knowledge," Holmes continued. "You were searching for continuity, a thought that passes beyond generations, without writing, without speech, a riddle passed like blood. Not past," she said, "buried and now recovered." Holmes placed the final silver piece on the cipher, completing the broken square. The paper shuddered. "I am not exaggerating, Watson." I saw it with my own eyes. The vellum rippled as though it were reacting to a breath of wind, though none stirred in that sealed room. And then the humming began again. Holmes stepped back, his eyes darting from symbol to symbol. The glyphs are aligning. They were never meant to be read left to right or top to bottom. They're harmonic, spatial. He turned to the woman. You've reconstructed the thought field, haven't you? We've only ever mirrored it, she said, until Elias. He completed the pattern without understanding it. He remembered a sound no one ever taught him. A note sung in silence. Holmes froze. And then I saw it, the shift. Something within him clicked. He turned to me, eyes bright. Watson, the puzzle pieces aren't the message. They're the keys to a sequence. Each one maps to a harmonic frequency, a silent note. Elias wasn't speaking in riddles. He was reciting a chord. A musical pattern? I asked. A psychological one, Holmes corrected. Certain sequences of shape, sound, and silence can elicit memory in the deepest regions of the mind, the parts formed before language. Elias wasn't decoding a cipher. He was the cipher. The woman approached the child-sized chair and placed one hand gently on the backrest. Sit, Mr. Holmes, she said softly, and see what he saw. Holmes stared at the chair for a long moment. Then, with remarkable calm, he walked to it and sat. Nothing happened for 5 full seconds. Then the room dimmed, not by candle or lamp, but as though something vast and unseen had passed between us and the outside world. The reflections in the mirror began to shift, not mimicking our movements, but preempting them. Holmes's image stood before he did, turned its head before he moved, lifted a hand before he even thought to raise it. And when Holmes did move, his actual body followed the reflection, not the other way around. I stepped forward, alarmed. "Holmes! Stay back," he said quickly. His voice was calm but strained. "I see it." "What do you see?" I asked. "The source." His pupils dilated, his posture rigid. "Watson, take notes." I scrambled for my notebook. He began to speak, not in riddles, but in cold, clear deduction. The mirrors were designed to reverse the act of reflection, to show not what stands before them, but what lies beneath the surface of perception, not a physical space, a conceptual one. The woman stood motionless, her eyes on Holmes as though awaiting confirmation of something long hoped for. He continued. They used Elias to tune the mirrors to a specific harmonic signature, one that echoes through consciousness across generations. They believe memory is not just a product of experience, but a field, a shared field. "The collective unconscious?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. But not as Jung understood it, not myth, data. Elias was not remembering a past, he was remembering an instruction. I stared. To what? To complete the field, to awaken it. Holmes stood abruptly, the chair scraping behind him. But the reflection did not follow. It remained seated. I gasped. Holmes stared at it. "That is not me." The woman stepped forward again. "No," she said gently. "It's what remains of Elias, the echo." The figure in the mirror lifted its head. It spoke, but not aloud in our minds. The mirror does not remember, it records. The child was the page. You are the pen. Then silence. Holmes took a slow step backward. The cipher on the floor burned faintly with a pale blue light. The parchment blackened at the edges, curling inward until only the center remained, the symbol of the broken square and the eye. Then that too vanished. Holmes turned to the woman. "It's over." She tilted her head. "No, it's begun. You completed the sequence. You are the first to survive it." "And the others?" he asked. "There were no others," she said. Holmes exhaled. "You've built a religion out of memory. We've built an architecture, one that requires you." Then came the final sound. footsteps behind us. I turned. Lestrade stood in the doorway with 2 constables, revolvers drawn. "Mr. Holmes," he said. "We came as you asked." Holmes looked at the woman and the man with the gloves. Then he said, "You're under arrest for unlawful experimentation, abduction, and conspiracy against the Crown." The woman smiled. "Do you really think the law will understand any of this?" Holmes nodded. "No," he said, "but I do, and that's enough." The arrest was executed without resistance, though I noted a curious serenity in both the woman and her gloved companion as they were led from the mirrored chamber by Lestrade's men. She didn't protest, nor did she seem concerned. Rather, she gave Holmes a final glance as she passed, and in that look I saw no malice, only something far more unsettling: completion. "Take them to the yard," Holmes' instructed, voice clipped, "but isolate them. No communication, no reflections, no light, unless absolutely necessary." Lestrade frowned. "Reflections? I'll explain later," Holmes replied, and with that they were gone, leaving Holmes and me alone in the shattered heart of Langmere Hall. The cipher had been consumed by its own activation. The chair was empty, the reflections had ceased their mimicry. The silence now was true. I waited for Holmes to speak, but he did not. He stood before the scorched outline on the floor where the puzzle pieces had aligned, staring into the place where the echo of Elias had last been seen. When he finally did speak, his voice was low, reverent, and, perhaps for the first time since I'd known him, tinged with something akin to awe. "We look in mirrors to understand the self," he murmured. "But what happens when the mirror begins to look back?" I said nothing. The question wasn't meant for me. He turned, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Come, Watson. We've seen what we came to see." Back at Baker Street, the storm had passed. Holmes went directly to the fire and added fresh coal with deliberate care, as though he needed the sound of it crackling to remind himself we had, indeed, returned to the ordinary world. I poured him a brandy. He accepted it wordlessly, sitting in his chair with the firelight dancing across his features. I took my place across from him, notebook still in hand, waiting for what I knew must come. The final deduction, the grand unravelling. He swirled the liquid in his glass and stared into it as he spoke. "This case, Watson, was never about crime in the conventional sense. No theft, no murder, no villain seeking gain. It was about memory, more specifically preserved memory, a concept that has, until now, lived only in the realm of poetry and philosophy." "The Harrow Group," I prompted, "believed memory could be transferred?" "No," Holmes corrected. "They believed it could be extracted, that within the human mind, especially that of a child untainted by language and logic, there might exist fragments of something older, something not taught, but inherited." I nodded slowly. "Like instinct?" "Like echo," he said. "They believed that certain symbols, harmonies, and reflections could activate stored knowledge buried deep in the folds of the brain, like unlocking a sealed letter written long before one's birth." He took a sip of the brandy. Elias was the first subject to resonate with their mirror circuit. The riddle speech, the reversed phrases, the obsession with silence, they were not symptoms of madness, they were signals. Signals to what? To something that had been waiting, Holmes said quietly. An idea, a pattern, a memory that remembers itself. I frowned. And the cipher? "A map," he replied, "not to a location, but to a sequence, like a musical composition written in symbols instead of notes. When Elias completed the pattern, he triggered a harmonic loop between mind and mirror. That light we saw was not a trick, it was an interface, a resonance between memory and mechanism." I shivered. But what was the purpose? Why go to such lengths? Holmes set the glass down. Because the woman, the one leading the Harrow group, believed that some memories should not be individual. She believed that there are universal thoughts, truths so essential they must be preserved outside of speech, beyond language. To remember them, one must become them. I blinked. But that's spiritual. Holmes gave a thin smile, or profoundly scientific, depending on your angle. We sat in silence a while longer. Then I asked the question that had haunted me since the moment Elias vanished into the mirror light. Do you believe he's gone? Holmes didn't answer at first. Finally, he said, I believe he transcended the circuit they created. He no longer functions within our framework of presence or absence. He is, in some way, stored, not dead, not entirely alive, but available, like a book whose cover has closed but whose pages are still warm. The fire crackled. I looked toward the shattered frame of the mirror still leaning in the corner of the room. Holmes had refused to discard it. He claimed it might, in time, become useful. So, I said carefully, what now? He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. The Harrow group is dismantled. The cipher is destroyed. The chamber at Langmere is no longer functional. And yet, I added, you said earlier it had begun. Holmes nodded. Because I sat in that chair. My eyes widened. You didn't complete the circuit, did you? No, he said. But I heard it, just for a moment, a whisper, no louder than the rustle of a curtain. What did it say? Holmes was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice nearly too soft to catch, he said, You are not alone. Others have remembered. I felt something cold brush the nape of my neck. Holmes stood, brushing the ash from his coat. The question is not what memory is, Watson. It's who it belongs to, and whether that mind ever truly forgets. I rose as well. Do you intend to tell the world? Holmes looked out the window at the mist curling over Baker Street. No, he said at last. Some truths must remain riddles, because the moment we answer them, we invite the question, was it ever our thought to begin with? And then he smiled, just faintly. Besides, he added, I've always preferred the company of mysteries to their solutions.